Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Again, another attempt at our virtual music, and I really appreciate your efforts, Alex. You know, sometimes during the middle of these stay-at-home days, I watch a show on Netflix in the middle of the day. The Reverend Theodore Parker was literate in 20 languages by the time he was 30 years old. And I Googled it, and it's true, Parker didn't have access to Netflix in 1840. That must be the difference. Now, sometimes I write 1,500-word sermons to share with you. That's about 4 or 5 single-space pages, and they really only take about 15 minutes to deliver. The Reverend Theodore Parker wrote 56-page sermons that required his congregation to take a lunch break between the two halves. Sometimes a congregation member will write me a note about one of my sermons, but normally the notes say something like, "What the heck did you mean when you said?" Now, the Reverend Theodore Parker received lots of those kind of letters, but also he received notes of recognition, albeit posthumously, for his sermons from President Abraham Lincoln and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And they didn't ask him what he meant by what he wrote. They actually lifted the words out of his sermon, reworked them a little bit, and dropped them right into their own historic speeches. I will say that I received a Bachelor of Arts degree from a major university, and Reverend Theodore Parker never received a bachelor's degree. I just wrote that down thinking that it would help my case, but now that I've said it out loud, I realize that it doesn't help at all. And I also recognize that today isn't about me versus Theodore Parker, but I've been swimming around with Parker for many hours over the past week, and at every turn, his efforts have astounded me. And I wanted to start by setting you up to understand how extraordinary the Reverend Theodore Parker was. He was born in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1810. He was the youngest of 10 siblings, and his grandfather had been the captain of the Lexington militia during the Revolutionary War. And growing up, a young Theodore would watch the townsfolk reenact that early morning of April 10th, 1775, when his grandfather led the locals in their skirmish with the British regulars. As an adult, Parker would tell a story of his childhood about wrestling with the doctrine of eternal damnation. He would recall that for years, he said, from about age 7 to 11, I said my prayers with much devotion. I then continued to repeat, "Lord, forgive my sins. Lord, forgive my sins. Lord, forgive my sins," until sleep came upon me. He claimed he ultimately, still as a child, but ultimately rejected the doctrine as unnatural. That would be the first challenge to Christian doctrine that Parker would deliver throughout his life. Parker didn't attend Harvard as an undergrad. At 19, he passed the entrance exam but could not afford the tuition. So he went to work as a teacher in the local area, and he read the entire Harvard curriculum on his own. When he was 24, recognizing his dedicated work, the Harvard Divinity School admitted him with advanced standing. After graduating and receiving his first called ministry position in 1837, Parker would spend the next 20 years delivering his evolving thought on the nature of Christianity through powerful and often intricate sermons. And it's not often that nowadays we actually read Parker's words because it's somewhat a disconnect sometimes. But I'm going to share some of his original texts, and again, I want to recognize that his statements of devotion to God and Christianity may make him hard to embrace for many modern Unitarian Universalists. Dean Grodzins, the author of a wonderful biography of Parker entitled American Heretic, said this: I suspect Parker held a view of the world that many today find alien. He continued, Parker was passionately religious, believed deeply in the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, without being theologically conservative. Parker's thoughts would result in him being called an infidel and castigated by conservative Unitarians and Trinitarians of his day. They called for him to resign his ministry. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the compelling part of Parker's work was that he never acceded to their demands. He steadfastly and very publicly believed he was a Christian in good standing. It was in May 1841 that Parker delivered a sermon entitled A Discourse on the Transient and Permanent in Christianity. It was a part of an ordination service for another minister in South Boston. And really succinctly and simply summarized, the permanent in Christianity, according to Parker, are the words of Jesus. The transient are the stories built up around Jesus. In his talk, Parker challenged the factuality of biblical miracles and the miraculous authority of the Bible itself. I hope you will also understand that what Parker was doing in this talk was plowing through latent structures of creedalism that Unitarians of his time were still clinging to. This is part of his legacy to we modern UUs. In his sermon on the permanent and the transient, he started with a stunning reveal of the permanent. I like this very much, and so these are Parker's words, and I'll try to do them somewhat justice. Nothing seems more fleeting than a word. It is an evanescent impulse of the most fickle element. It leaves no track where it went through the air, yet to this and this only did Jesus entrust the truth with which he came laden to the earth. Truth for the salvation of the world. He took no pains to perpetuate his thoughts. They were poured forth where occasion found audience, by the side of the sea, or a well, in a cottage or a temple, in a fisher's boat or the synagogue. He founds no institution as a monument to his words. He appoints no order of men to preserve his bright and glad revealings. He only bids his friends proclaim the truths they had received. He did not even write his words in a book. With noble confidence, the result of abiding faith, he scattered them broadcast on the world, leaving the seed to its own vitality, knowing that what is true and of God cannot fail, for God keeps his own. He sowed his seed in the heart and left it there, to be watered and warmed by the dew of the sun, which heaven sends. He felt the good never perishes without doing its work. He knew his words were for eternity. So he trusted them to the uncertain air. And for 1,800 years, the faithful element has held them good, distinct as when they were first warm from his lips. Now it translates them into every human speech and murmurs them in all earth's 1,000 tongues, from pine forest of the north to the palm groves of the east. In the meantime, the words of great men and mighty, whose names shook whole continents, though graven in metal and stone, though stamped in institutions and defended by whole tribes of priests and troops of followers, their words have gone to ground, and the world gives back no echo of their voice. After an hour and 15 minutes, Parker finished his talk on the permanent and the transient. It took about 2 weeks for the storm of negative reaction to swirl and land on Parker. A group of Trinitarian ministers had come to the talk, and they wrote a public letter calling Parker's sermon deistic and impious. They asked to be informed if the Unitarian clergy of Boston and the vicinity sympathize with Parker's thoughts. Well, Many of his Unitarian colleagues did not sympathize with Parker, and the conflict grew particularly intense with his colleagues in the Boston Association of Congregational Ministers, an all-Unitarian association. That association had a confrontational meeting with Parker in January of 1843, in which they tried to persuade him to resign his membership. He refused. It deserves noting that as his fellow clergy were assailing him, he was speaking to crowds of 2,000 people on each Sunday. And he was quickly becoming prominently recognized as a leading intellectual in the Northeast. It was in the fall of 1843 that Parker took a European sabbatical with his wife Lydia. The trip is characterized by his biographers as Parker's first exposure to great inequalities of wealth and political despotism. It led him to think increasingly about democracy, democratic society, and democratic culture. Inspired by his European visit, Parker began to recognize America as becoming what he called an industrial democracy. He lifted up his vision of that democracy in several sermons, calling for it to be a true democracy as opposed to an aristocracy or monarchy. He declared that government must be an organic expression of the whole people's mind, conscience, and piety. And it would achieve that true democracy when it was of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. Clearly, that's the thought that Abraham Lincoln rephrased in his Gettysburg Address when he said, "That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth." For me, knowing that Parker's original included all the people, I can't help but think Lincoln's Civil War battlefield speech would have been even more powerful if he had left the word all in. Parker's sermons began to move from primarily theological content to cultural, social, and political reform. He supported efforts to alleviate urban poverty and urged the criminal justice system to reform criminals, not simply punish them. And he advocated for the end of the degradation of women, endorsing women's suffrage in a sermon in 1853. That sermon had a clunky title maybe, but it was entitled The Public Function of Women. In recognition of our celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, I thought I'd read a couple of stanzas from Parker's sermon from some 70 years before the final passage of the 19th Amendment. Parker said at one point in the sermon, "Now see what follows. Women have the same individual right to determine their aim in life and to follow it. They have the same individual rights of body and spirit, of mind and conscience and heart and soul, the same physical rights, the same intellectual, moral, affectional, and religious rights that any man has. That is true of womankind as a whole, as it is true of Jane, Ellen, and Sally, and each special woman that can be named." And he continued, "The rights of individualism are not possessed, developed, and used and enjoyed by a life of solitude, but by joint action. Accordingly, to possess, use, develop, and enjoy these rights, there must be a concerted joint action, else individuality is only a possibility, not a reality. So, the individual rights of women carry with them the same domestic, social, ecclesiastical, and political rights as those of men." I was struck later in that sermon by several paragraphs that each kind of started with, "If these affairs had been under a woman's control." He would go on to excoriate the actions of men and extol the potential for more healthy and more humane outcomes if women had been involved in making those decisions. I will offer one of those paragraphs to you and I alert you that there is some blunt language here in the treatment of Native American people that is included in this paragraph. But Parker wrote, "If the affairs of the nation had been under women's joint control, I doubt we should have butchered the Indians with such exterminating savagery. That in 50 years we should have spent $700 million for war, and now in time of peace send 20 annual millions more to the same waste. I doubt that we should have spread slavery into 9 new states and made it national. I think the Fugitive Slave Bill would never have been an act. Women have some respect for the natural law of God." That's one paragraph in one sermon, and he cut across women's rights, the devastation of the Native American world, an anti-war appeal, and a challenge to slavery. In terms of his vision for justice, Parker's view of the world seems to be entirely embraceable by modern Unitarian Universalists. That Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, and it was part of what was called the Compromise of 1850, and that compromise was really a collection of bills that defined how the emerging split between free and slave states would be navigated. One part of the compromise tried to resolve debates over introducing slavery into the new territories acquired at the end of the Mexican-American War. Another part was the Fugitive Slave Act. That act federalized the effort to capture and return people who were enslaved and had escaped to free states, to return them back to the enslavement and the states they had fled. Parker saw slavery as the greatest obstacle to achieving his sense of an industrial democracy. He denounced the Mexican-American War as an attempt to expand slavery and led the Boston opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. Most Boston Unitarian ministers either refused to oppose the legislation or publicly supported it as a constitutional obligation and as a politically necessary concession to the South that would, in their words, save the Union and settle the slavery issue. Parker pronounced that the act was a violation of Christian ideals and a threat to free institutions. In his sermon of conscience in 1850, he openly called for the act to be defied. He also chaired the executive committee of the Vigilance Committee, the principal Boston organization that provided fugitives with material aid, legal assistance, and help in eluding capture. In 1850, when a fugitive in his congregation, Ellen Craft, was threatened with arrest, he hid her in his own house until arrangements could be made to send her to Canada. And in 1854, his agitation on behalf of another fugitive, Anthony Burns, led to Parker's indictment by a federal grand jury. He was charged with obstructing a federal marshal. Popular opinion was so much on his side, however, that prosecuting him became a political impossibility, and a year later, the case was dismissed on a technicality. It was during this time of resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act that it is reported that Parker worked at night writing his sermons with a loaded gun on his desk. He was determined to fend off the bloodhounds, as the slave hunters were called, and protect folks hiding within his care. Maybe the pistol was on his desk the night he wrote his sermon of justice and conscience in 1853. This powerful talk essentially called out the necessity of intentional acts to make our world more just. Parker wrote very simply at one point, "We need great and conscious development of the moral element in people and a corresponding expansion of justice in human affairs." Also, in this sermon, he wrote, "Things refuse to be mismanaged long. Jefferson trembled when he thought of slavery and remembered that God is just. Ere long, all America will tremble. Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I'm sure it bends toward justice. Of course, it was on March 31st in 1968, in his speech at the National Cathedral, that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King declared that we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Much has been written and thought about the difference between the two men's view of that arc. And I do encourage you all to source some of that writing on your own. Otherwise, if I included it in this sermon, we'd have to take a lunch break to get through it. So I'm not going to do that. Parker's health began to fail in 1857, and in January 1859, he suffered a collapse brought on by tuberculosis. It ended his ministerial career. In February, he left a wintry Boston with his wife and others for the warmth of the Caribbean, and while on the island of Santa Cruz in March and April, he wrote a long autobiographical letter to his congregation that was also a confession of faith. It was soon published as Theodore Parker's Experience as a Minister. In typical Parker style, that letter was over 200 pages long. Parker then traveled to England, Switzerland, and Italy. His condition worsened in the winter of 1859, and he died on May 10th in 1860 in Florence, Italy. The story goes that Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist and notable orator, was touring Europe in 1887. He took an overnight train from Rome to Florence, arriving early on May 10th. Our first move outward after coffee was to visit the grave of Theodore Parker, Douglass would write later. He had arranged to arrive on the anniversary of his friend's death 27 years before. Douglass had found in Parker an ally and spiritual friend a decade before that, when they had worked together to protect fugitives and to end slavery. Douglass wrote to another friend, Theodore Stanton, by the way, the son of the women's rights advocate Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Theodore had warned him that the dingy plain marker on Parker's grave was not worthy of the heroic, eloquent man buried beneath it. Douglass wrote that he had to agree. I am not an advocate of costly monuments over the decaying bodies of the dead, he wrote, but the stone at such a man's grave should be a sermon. Douglass and Stanton arranged for the noted sculptor William Wetmore Story to create a new monument. It calls Parker the great American preacher and adds, his name is engraved in marble, his virtues in the hearts of those he helped free from slavery and superstition. But the stone at such a man's grave should be a sermon. Douglass's words are absolutely true for Theodore Parker. Janine, I'll invite you to play that music now.